Malice Aforethought by Francis Iles. Read by Bruce Montague. Part 1. Chapter 1. It was not until several weeks after he had decided to murder his wife that Dr. Bickley took any active steps in the matter. Murder is a serious business. The slightest slip may be disastrous. Dr. Bickley had no intention of risking disaster. Naturally, his decision did not arrive ready-made. It evolved gradually, the fruit of much wistful cogitation. And if cogitation, however wistfully nebulous, must have its starting point, that of Dr. Bickley's might be looked for in a certain tennis party on a hot Saturday afternoon towards the end of June. It was a party that the Bickleys themselves were giving. Half Wyvern's Cross was coming to it. All Wyvern's Cross, in fact, that counted. Dr. Bickley, coming back to lunch only a few minutes short of 2 o'clock, tired after a long and strenuous morning's round, found Fairlawn in a state of no little turmoil, and his wife impatiently waiting, the dining-room cleared. "Really, Edmund," she greeted him, peering at him disapprovingly through the thick glasses she wore. "Really, I think you might have been considerate enough to get back a little earlier today. How can Florence get on with the sandwiches if you keep her waiting to wash up your lunch things like this?" When her husband was late, Mrs. Bickley invariably took her meals alone at their correct times. "I'm sorry, Julia. I thought I'd better try to get through my list this morning, so as to be free this afternoon." "Well, of course." Mrs. Bickley contrived to reconcile the two apparently irreconcilable necessities by conveying her impression that her husband must have wilfully dawdled by the wayside. Dr. Bickley poured himself out a glass of beer from the bottle by his plate and carved some cold leg of lamb. He was too tired at the moment to attempt to extenuate himself further. Besides, he knew it would be quite useless. He looked sadly at the joint in front of him. There was no knuckle left on it, and the knuckle was the only part he liked. Unfortunately, Julia liked it too. He began to eat without enthusiasm. Julia stood over him sentinel-like. When he made as if to help himself to more beer, she interposed. "No, Edmund, one glass is quite enough for you on a day like this." "The hotter the day, the better the drink, my dear," suggested the doctor, but without very much hope. Julia, who disapproved of facetiousness as much as she disapproved of most other things, only frowned. "You have too much to do to sit here drinking. Besides, you know how beer makes you perspire. Do you want any more meat? Then you had better ring at once." Dr. Bickley rose. He did not point out that, as Julia was standing already, she might perhaps ring the bell herself and save him the trouble. Julia would consider it middle-class manners to ring a bell herself when there was a man in the room to do it instead. And middle-class manners were, to Julia, what patent medicines were to himself. Quite impossible. Mrs. Bickley was 8 years older than her husband, 45 to his 37. She was also a good 2 inches taller, for Dr. Bickley was an unusually small man. A somewhat gaunt, erect woman, with frizzy dark hair, and a thin-lipped mouth that twisted decidedly downwards at the corners, she had a quite unjoyful as well as a quite unlovely face, and she wore rimless pince-nez, not horn-rimmed spectacles, in front of her slightly prominent pale blue eyes. The two had been married 10 years and had no children. When Florence had brought in the remains of a cold gooseberry pie and departed again, Julia began to give her husband his instructions. "You'd better put the net up first. It sags so during the first half-hour. The new balls are in the cupboard under the stairs. We'll use them, of course, but you can give the old ones a rubbing on the hall mat as well. Then there are the 2 tables to be taken out and the chairs, and I think we'll have the bathing tent up as well in this sun. Then you'll have to— I don't think I shall be able to get all these things done, interrupted the doctor with a doubtful air. My dear Edmund, they've got to be done. Yes, but I haven't finished my round yet. Couldn't get them all in this morning. There are 2 more visits I must make. Julia frowned. Who? Mrs. Parrott and the Holm boy. They are not urgent? Not urgent, no, but quite serious enough. Not so serious as all that, pronounced Julia. They can wait perfectly well. You can see them after the people have gone. But that won't be till after surgery time in any case. Then you'll have to see them after surgery, said Julia calmly, knocking his evening meal, as it were, out of her husband's mouth. Have you finished? No, you've no time for cheese. Hurry, please, Edmund. Dr. Bickley reflected that at any rate there would be a good tea today. Well, it's just as well we don't give tennis parties every day, he said amiably enough, as he massaged his neat little moustache with his napkin and pushed back his chair. Feeling better for his hurried meal, he put on his hat and went into the garden. The tennis posts were of an antiquated pattern, and the handle most difficult to wind as the net began to tauten. Julia had been repeating for several years that they must get new ones next season, but somehow there never seemed to be quite enough money for such an article of sheer luxury. And in any case, as she did not have to wind the net up herself, the matter was not very important to her. The doctor had to lean the whole of his meagre 8.5 stones on the handle for the last turn or 2 to get the net to the required height. That feat accomplished, he stood back and wiped his forehead. He was not in good condition, and the winding of a tennis net can be a strenuous business. Then, as always after any physical exertion, he touched carefully the waxed tips of his moustache. The guests had been asked for 3:30, and it was now already 1/4 to the hour. Glancing guiltily at his watch, Dr. Bickley hurried up the little bank that bounded the tennis court on the side nearest the house, turning up the sleeves of his buff-coloured cotton shirt, with 2 collars to match, as he went. His neat blue coat was already hanging on one of the tennis posts. Dr. Bickley invariably wore a blue serge suit for his work. Country practitioners who made their rounds in old tweed coats and shapeless flannel trousers always seemed to him to be letting down the dignity of the profession. Even to wind up the net and bring out the chairs, Dr. Bickley wore a spotless grey Trilby hat, with a turned-up and corded brim, a hat to which an advertisement writer could have applied no other word but natty. As he brought out and set up the deck chairs, he tried to arrange in his mind the rest of his tasks in their best order. The bathing tent had better go up next, for the next day was a blazing one, and complexions are important things even in the country. Then it would be useless to start with only 6 balls, if Benji Tour was on the first set, for that morose young man had a gloomily vigorous style, and it was uncanny how he seemed to land balls right in the middle of the almost impenetrable gooseberry plantation in the kitchen garden. Then the 2 collapsible tables would need to be up and bearing their quotas of cigarettes, matches and glasses before the first people arrived, for nothing looked so bad as to bring these things out haphazard afterwards. Dr. Bickley was almost as particular as his wife about things being done in the right way when guests were about. It seemed to him that everything was just as urgent as everything else. He was struggling with the bathing tent when Julia came out of the house and joined him. "You've done the net, Edmund?" she asserted. There was no need to ask, as the net was in position to answer for itself, but Mrs. Bickley never minded putting the obvious into words. Dr. Bickley paused in his labours to agree that he had done the net. "It's sagging already. You'd better tighten it up at once." The doctor hurried over to the post and leaned on the handle. Julia was not satisfied till the net was raised a whole turn, beyond what Dr. Bickley had secretly imagined to be the limit of his capacity. Panting slightly, he rejoined her at the top of the bank. Mrs. Bickley was surveying the rest of the court with a cold eye. "The lines don't look at all good. Did you tell Widdicombe to do them this morning?" "I told him distinctly, but you know what Widdicombe is, my dear." "I do," replied Julia grimly. "He scamped them as usual." On a Saturday afternoon, Widdicombe was no longer available to repair his omissions of the morning. Dr. Bickley scrutinized the lines with an earnest frown. "I think he has done them, though. Yes, I'm sure he has." "Only once, if at all. Dear me, it's a pity I can't be in a dozen places at once to see to everything myself." Her tone rebuked her husband for being out on his rounds and unable to supervise the malingering Widdicombe from there. "Well, you'll have to run over them again yourself, Edmund, as soon as you've finished the other things." "I'll try," said Dr. Bickley a little doubtfully, for he had been wondering whether he would be able to get everything else done in time. "Try? It must be done." "Well, if it must, it must," at once agreed the little man with his habitual amiability. "So I'd better get on with this confounded tent. It's being more of a nuisance than ever, of course." Mrs. Bickley, whose immediate tasks had apparently been disposed of, walked off with her usual purposeful air to the rose garden. The morning paper was under her arm. It occurred to neither of them that she should relieve her husband's congested time by doing the lines herself. Before her marriage, Mrs. Bickley had been a Crewe Stanton. She was, in everything but name, a Crewe Stanton still. She showed her husband so several times a day. During their short engagement, she had informed her fiancé not once, but several times, with the air of one imparting interesting information, that her grandmother would have no more contemplated sitting down to a meal with her doctor than with her butler. And here was she, Julia, actually contemplating marrying one. It was, really, Julia would point out with a short laugh, enough to make that grandmother turn in her grave, and Dr. Bickley agreed with her that it was. His wife had reminded him of this singular turn of fortune at frequent intervals ever since, and Dr. Bickley continued to express his sympathy for the feelings of the grandmother had she been alive to experience them. For the Crewe Stantons, once one of the most important families in North Devonshire, had dwindled shockingly. Sir Charles, the 12th baronet, had preferred to pay his crushing new taxes by selling piecemeal bits and slices of the wide Crewe Stanton lands, instead of altering his way of living, and now inhabited with his other daughter a small villa on the outskirts of Torquay, where he was sinking angrily into the grave as fast as unlimited whisky could help him, but not fast enough for his unmarried daughter. The Crewe Stanton lands had gone. 3 Crewe Stanton sons, who had been brought up with a valet apiece and unlimited small change, were vegetating miserably, one pretending to manage a banana estate in Jamaica, one making belief to be doing useful work in a surgical bandage firm in Derby, and one, the only one, putting his expensive education to good account by keeping himself in comparative comfort by his skill in bridge, billiards, and poker. Only the fourth, the youngest, had really made a success of his life. He had married a well-known actress, who was able to support him, more or less, in the style to which he had been accustomed. Julia, offered the alternative of marriage with a man whom her grandmother could never have entertained at her own table, or joining her younger sister in the ménage at Torquay, then being seriously discussed as an impossible but inevitable future, had not hesitated for a moment. Not that she had ever been grateful to Edmund. That she was 35 years old, had years ago parted with any hopes that she might have ever entertained of marriage, and possessed a face not unlike that of her own favourite horse, as her sister Hilda, a candid woman, immediately pointed out on learning of the engagement, weighed nothing against the fact that she was a Crewe Stanton. Julia had only one criterion, and that was birth. Any gratitude for the marriage, and how much gratitude was due, perhaps only Julia could estimate, was owed by Edmund. And for the last 10 years it was impossible to complain that Edmund had failed her in that respect. The Bickleys' tennis party was to be quite an important event for Wyvern's Cross. In a community of not much more than 100 souls, the principal ones, the super souls, are collected in a single gathering far less frequently than one might expect. Wyvern's Cross called itself a village, but it was little more than a hamlet, and within a 2-mile radius of the crossroads in its centre there were not more than 20 people whom one being Mrs. Bickley, could possibly invite to a tennis party at one's house. On this occasion Mrs. Bickley invited them all. The Bickleys had only one court, but out of those invited, at least half did not play tennis at all. An invitation to tennis in rural England does not imply any ability to play the game. The dividing line between those asked to tennis parties and those not asked is a social, not an athletic one. Naturally, there was a reason for the unusual size of this particular party. One does not ask close on 20 people whom one does not like without a reason. The reason was a Miss Madeleine Cranmer. Miss Cranmer had just taken the hall, bought it outright, in fact, as everyone for miles around knew, after the latter had lain vacant for something like 5 years, ever since Colonel Swincombe's death, and his daughter's discovery that her father's passion for rare bulbs had robbed her of the possibility of maintaining the hall after he had left it. She had therefore retired to Brighton, where her feelings were unlikely to be harassed by the sight of a bulb again, and left the hall to be let or sold. And now, after 5 whole years, Miss Madeleine Cranmer. That was exciting enough in all conscience, but what made it almost unbearably more so was that Miss Cranmer was not only very rich, but not by any means ill-looking and quite young, and that she actually proposed to live at the Hall quite alone, without even a companion or an aunt. The vicar, the Reverend Herbert Armstrong, was reputed to be distinctly concerned about it. Miss Cranmer had been installed now for nearly a fortnight. Mrs. Bickley, as by right, had called at the earliest opportunity, and now she had organised this tennis party to introduce the girl to such of her neighbours as she would be expected to know. By 4:15, the affair was in full progress. The Tors, as usual, had been the first to arrive. There were 4 Tors: the Reverend Hessery and his wife, his daughter Cornian, and his son Benjy. Where Mr. Tor led, Miss Wopsworthy and Miss Peavy were never far behind, They were the next arrivals. But neither played tennis, and the first set could not be arranged until the two young Ridgways, Harford and his sister Ivy, made their appearance. Mrs. Bickley then deftly split the families. It was always Mrs. Bickley who arranged the sets at Fairlawn, and Cornian Tor and Harford Ridgway were sent to play Ivy Ridgway and Benjy Tor. This set had been played at least 50 times before in Wyvern's Cross, and all four players knew that the former pair would beat the latter by 6 games to 2. They always did, but the inevitability never made the least difference to Benjy losing his temper about it in the 5th game. "Edmund," observed Mrs. Bickley, as the players strolled onto the court exchanging the stilted amiabilities of people who know each other exceedingly well meeting on a formal occasion. "Edmund, I know Mrs. Tor wants to see the roses first of all." "Of course," beamed Dr. Bickley. "Of course," echoed Mrs. Tor, rather less enthusiastically. She had walked up from the vicarage, and her shoes were new and tight. She would much rather have sat down and rested first. "You were telling me only the other day what a wonderful show you have this year, weren't you?" she hurried on, having intercepted a disapproving glance from her husband's fish-like but expressive eye. Of course, she remembered now. Hessery had said he wanted a few words with Mrs. Bickley privately. This would be an excellent opportunity before the others arrived. "Yes, I shall be most interested. You've got some quite new kinds this year, haven't you, Dr. Bickley? Let me see. And perhaps you'd like to take the opportunity too, Miss Wopsworthy, while my husband is free to show them to you properly?" Mrs. Bickley cut ruthlessly across Mrs. Tor's garrulity. "I know how interested you are, and you too, Miss Peavy." Miss Wopsworthy, a tall, thin lady who wore a straw hat trimmed with very red roses on the extreme apex of her head, intimated that she would be glad to make use of such an opportunity, as indeed in social duty bound, though she somehow managed to preserve an air of her own independence in her agreement. Miss Peavy, on the other hand, was frankly intimidated, and looked it. "Very well, Edmund," said Mrs. Bickley, with finality. The quartet moved off. In the rose garden, the little doctor pointed out with pride his new Margaret Macreadys and Mrs. Van Rossums. Roses were his hobby, and his infectious enthusiasm triumphed over Mrs. Tor's new shoes. On the court, the 3rd game being still in progress, Benjy Tor had not yet lost his temper. His lanky form, in interesting contrast to Harford Ridgway's solid stolidity on the other side of the net, was still twisting actively, if ineffectually, and had not yet begun to droop in the bitterness of defeat. Nor had the errors of Ivy, who managed to combine on a tennis court a most pleasingly artless grace of movement with complete ineptitude at the game itself, so that she was both a joy and a grief to watch, had time so far to produce their usual exasperating effect on him. Ivy, in consequence, was playing a good deal better than she would be towards the end of the set. Seated in state under the umbrella top of the bathing tent, Mrs. Bickley and the Reverend Hessery Tor were discussing the subject on which he had desired the 2 minutes of Mrs. Bickley's private conversation. "Really, this young woman whom we are to meet this afternoon, Miss Cranmer, it must be nearly 4 o'clock already." "She's unpardonably late," said Mrs. Bickley resentfully, though several others besides Miss Cranmer had not yet appeared. The only fresh arrival since the set had begun was young Denny Bourne, down from Oxford the day before, and very correct in an old Etonian blazer and shining flannels, who was helping Dr. Bickley retrieved the balls which Benjy, growing more wild with every minute, as the iron of defeat seared deeper into his soul, was now dispatching into the gooseberry bushes with the despondent regularity of a machine-gun. One would really have thought on this occasion, at least, she would have taken the trouble to be punctual. Considering, added Mr. Torr's tones, that she must have known that I was to be here. You haven't met her yet? No, said Mr. Torr in his gravest voice. I thought it better to give her a little more time to settle in before calling. He shook his massive head. But if rumour is correct, I fear... Yes, I fear that she must be a very odd young woman. She doesn't appear to be related to the Hampshire Cranmers, snapped Mrs. Bickley, as if that in itself were very odd. I've never heard of any others. But Mr. Torr was not to be headed off the main track. You really did gather that she intends to live at the Hall quite alone, except, of course, for the servants? Yes, I feared so. A most equivocal position, most equivocal. I agree with you, Mr. Torr. It's not a thing one cares about at all in this neighbourhood. She is quite young, I understand. Quite. She can't be a day over 22. I sounded her, tactfully, of course. I felt it my duty to all of us to do that much, and I gathered that she has been an orphan for some years. Evidently she has just come into control of her own money, and it's turned her head. Very sad, clucked Mr. Torr. Very sad. Someone will have to speak to her, pronounced Mrs. Bickley. Not obviously. There's no need to be unkind. Doubtless it's nothing but thoughtlessness, but just to let her see what one feels. Precisely. Mr. Torr seemed relieved. Precisely. That, in fact, is just what I had made up my mind must be done, Mrs. Bickley. I am delighted to hear you confirm it. The task is not one I should choose, but one has one's responsibilities. In my position... Mr. Torr cleared his throat with grave and sober sonority, as befitted a man in his position. But do you think it's quite a man's job? For once, Mrs. Bickley did not seem so decided. Wouldn't it be better if... My wife, you mean? Mr. Torr's tone was unflatteringly dubious. Well, I had rather felt that the responsibility might, in a way, be considered mine. After all, one's upbringing. I could hint it to her quite nicely, you see, but without nonsense. I remember that my grandmother once had occasion... Lady Denbury, I mean, not Lady Crewe Stanton. Mrs. Bickley looked extremely serious. Mr. Torr looked extremely serious too. Their tongues worked busily. The clacking of them reached Quarnion Torr on the tennis court as she was about to serve in the final game. To her partner, as he supplied her with balls, she remarked, Daddy seems to have properly got off with that ghastly woman. Before Mrs. Bickley and Mr. Torr could decide who was to voice their displeasure to the unconventional Miss Cranmer, everything began to happen at once, as it always does after such peaceful interludes. The set came to an end. The two ladies, whom Mrs. Torr had determinedly held in the rose garden while her revered lord had his private conversation, were at last released, and streaked for the deck chairs and the shade like two terriers let off the leash. Dennis Bourne and Dr. Bickley retrieved the last ball from the gooseberry bushes and strolled back to the court, and Mr. Chatford arrived, a solicitor who practised in neighbouring Merchester but lived alone, a bachelor in Wyvern's Cross. "Well, how shall we play now?" said Dr. Bickley, removing his hat for a moment to apply a handkerchief delicately to his brow, but still amiable, even towards Benjy. "Let's see. Gwynifred hasn't turned up yet, so it looks as if you, Quarnion, and Ivy will have to play again." Miss Wopsworthy had passed the age when she could appear on a tennis court, and though Miss Peavy did not privately think that she had, it had been borne in upon her that others did. "Here come the Davies," said someone, as a couple came into sight around the angle of the house. "Come along, Mrs. Davy," called the doctor jovially, waving his racket. "You're just in time. We want you." "Then you can have a men's four," said Mrs. Bickley in her decisive tones, just as if her husband had not spoken at all. "Mr. Davy and Dennis against Benjy and Harford." "Rather sit out if don't mind," mumbled Benjy sulkily. "Can't hit a ball today. Dr. Bickley, play instead of me." "Nonsense, Benjy," retorted Mrs. Bickley, regardless of maternal feelings. "You only played badly because you were losing." "You play, Benjy, my boy," Dr. Bickley smiled, clapping him on the back. "Enjoy yourself while you're young." "I'd rather sit out this time, really, Mrs. Bickley," pleaded Harford Ridgway, whose solid flesh did look as if it was doing its best to melt. "That set quite exhausted me." "Very well, Edmund," said Mrs. Bickley, accepting this excuse. "You can play, then." The four men took off their coats, and the others regrouped themselves. Harford Ridgway found himself in a deck chair beside Quarnion Tor, at a safe distance from their elders. He was an engineer, with a post in a large firm at Middlesbrough, now in Wyvern's Cross for part of his holidays. Quite inevitably, the conversation turned in the direction of Mrs. Bickley. Harford, a charitable soul, murmured something about the lady not being so bad when you knew her. Quarnion at once dealt with this suggestion. "My dear Harford, you know perfectly well how she caught poor little Teddy." She explained the process in detail. Harford shifted uneasily. Quarnion had a raucous voice. "And anyhow," she summed up, "Teddy's much too sweet for her. He really is rather sweet, isn't he?" "Is he? I think he's an awful little worm." "Oh. Well, ask Ivy what she thinks," observed Miss Tor maliciously. "And anyhow," she defended her sex, "most people do like him. He's awfully popular around here, you know. You're jealous, that's all." "Jealous? Good Lord, why?" "Well, he and Ivy were rather thick at one time. But of course," added Miss Tor hastily, seeing her companions frown, "that's all over now. Teddy's got eyes for no one but Gwynifred Rattery nowadays." "Gwynifred?" repeated Harford in surprise. "But she isn't even here." "No, and that's why Teddy's looking so glum." "Oh, rot, Quarnion," said young Mr. Ridgway, with the discomfort of the average male before the almost pathological zest for gossip, which the English countryside seems to evoke in certain female breasts. "You're making this up." Miss Tor proceeded, with energy and examples, to rebut this charge. In the meantime, the rest of the party was still waiting, and now with undisguised impatience, for Miss Madeleine Cranmer. Besides the Davies, a London novelist in search of Devonshire local colour, and his wife, temporary visitors only to Wyvern's Cross, one person alone was indifferent to Miss Cranmer's remarkable absence. Dr. Bickley did not care in the least whether she ever came or not. He was waiting, with an impatience that had almost reached bursting point, for Gwynifred Rattery. At 20 minutes past 4, Madeleine Cranmer arrived. She had a reasonable explanation. Her car had refused to start, and the combined attempts of her 2 gardeners and herself, none of whom knew the least thing about dealing with refractory cars, had produced no impression on it until a quarter of an hour ago. Then, intimidated apparently by the growing wrath of the head gardener, the car had been cowed into starting as mysteriously as it had before refused. Miss Cranmer recounted this story with such seriousness, and accompanied it with such a reiteration of earnest apologies, not only to her hostess but to the other people who really mattered, such as Miss Wopsworthy and Mr. Torr, that the unfavourable feeling which her non-arrival had caused was not only wiped out, but actually gave place to a positively favourable one. Even Mr. Torr, who had been disposed to be quite stiff, found his disapproval thawing before the melting appeal of Miss Cranmer's enormous grey eyes, which mutely implored his forgiveness at any rate. She had then undergone the ordeal of introduction to a dozen complete strangers, all ready to be more than critical, with a grave appreciation of the seriousness of the occasion which impressed everyone. Miss Cranmer, confided Mr. Davy to Miss Peavy, is evidently one of those fortunate people who can make every stranger feel that he or she is the person they've been longing in secret all their lives to meet. "Oh, yes, I do agree," elaborately mouthed Miss Peavy, though the subject of their conversation was at least 30 yards away. "I think she'll be a great asset to us. I think she's so nice." Miss Wopsworthy, the 3rd member of the trio, sniffed. It was well known that Adela Peavy was foolish enough to think everyone nice at first sight. But even Miss Wopsworthy did not sniff with quite so much conviction as usual. The men's 4 being now over, Mrs. Bickley gave the word for tea, and they all trooped into the house together, to crowd with exaggerated cheerfulness into the not very large drawing-room. As they went, Mr. Torr managed to confide to his hostess that Miss Cranmer was very different from what he had expected, very different indeed. Quite a sensible young woman, none of the modern flightiness that he had feared, an old-fashioned type of a girl, such as it was a pleasure nowadays to see. Mrs. Bickley went so far as to agree that if any girl could live alone at the Hall without disgracing the neighbourhood, it really did seem as if Miss Cranmer might be the one. Gradually, people sorted themselves out in the drawing-room. Extra chairs had been brought in from the dining-room, but even then some of the men had to stand. Dapper, in his blue coat and white flannels, Dr. Bickley was very active. "Edmund!" called his wife, if he lingered to exchange more than a bare word with anyone before all were supplied with tea, and back he would dart to collect from the tray in front of her 2 more cups. The other men were doing their share too, but Dr. Bickley carried more cups than any 2 put together. "Dr. Bickley," Mrs. Torr shook an arch finger at him across the room, "I've hardly had a word with you all afternoon. You must come and tell me all the news, you really must. The doctor always knows so much more about what's going on in the parish than the vicar, doesn't he?" This was a somewhat unfortunate remark, for Mr. Torr was notoriously the last person ever to know what was going on under his own nose or within his own circle of duties. The Reverend Hethery Torr was inclined to take himself rather more seriously than his duties. "Mother putting her foot in it as usual," confided Cornian to young Dennis Bourne, who was offering her a plate of fish-paste sandwiches with perfect deportment. Young Mr. Bourne raised his eyebrows just a quarter of an inch and let it go at that. As the only son of Sir John Bourne, the local M.F.H. squirearch and general father of the community, Denny had cultivated the art of eyebrow-lifting to a nicety. "For instance, how is old Mrs. Brent getting on?" Mrs. Torr was asking hastily, as if conscious herself that her last remark was not altogether a happy one. "Oh, much better this morning," beamed the little doctor, as he edged through the throng towards her. "In fact, Edmund! Excuse me, Mrs. Torr, rather a busy moment just now." He spun round and hurried back to duty. "Such a nice man," prattled Mrs. Torr to Mary Davy, whom she had adopted by now as best friend for the afternoon. Mr. Torr had already appropriated Miss Cranmer, whom he was feeding now with earnest intensity on little pink cakes, which she accepted from him as one being vouchsafed manna from a being. "Of course Mrs. Bickley is very nice too," babbled Mrs. Torr, whom that lady frightened half out of her wits, and who would willingly walk a mile out of her way in new shoes to avoid her. "Oh, charming, but really, the doctor. Well, my dear, I always say that he—" "Will you be like that when you're married, Denny?" giggled Quarnion. "No, don't go. I want another of those." "I bet you won't." "Like what?" coldly queried Dennis Bourne, sadly conscious that his eyebrows for once had failed. Yet 3 years ago at Eton he had only to raise them less than that, and Dennis did not like Quarnion, nor did he like being called Denny, a shameful relic of his nursery days. "At your wife's beck and call every minute." "I really can't tell you, Quarnion." And Dennis bore his plate of sandwiches away with a slightly abstracted air of a man about to go and talk with someone about something pretty serious. The two Ridgeways, as usual in a crowd, had gravitated together, where they would stand side by side and say nothing. Harford, stolidly, Ivy, a little fearfully. She was a pretty little thing, in a rather indeterminate way, with lots of fair, very soft hair that curled naturally away from her small head, and big, frightened blue eyes. Her figure was slight and delicately boned, and she conveyed an impression of startled fragility in almost ludicrous contrast with her brother's massive stolidity. From time to time she was unable to resist throwing an occasional appealing glance in the direction where Dr. Bickley was talking with Peter Davy, but the former was evidently too busy with his important guest to be able to come over to them. Mr. Chatford, however, attached himself and began to make somewhat stilted conversation. He was a dark-browned, intensely shaven man, with a highly professional manner even in private life, who spent his time trying to make himself and everyone else forget that he had originally joined the firm in which he was now the sole partner as its office boy. Being now reckoned the best solicitor in his own district of North Devon, he was in a fair way to succeed in this aim. To this little group in due course added himself Benjy Torr, addressing himself exclusively to Ivy. By imperceptible degrees, so naturally that nobody but Mr. Chatford could have said how it had come about, the quartet, still talking amicably, split into 2 pairs, having no connection with each other at all, and one of the 2 pairs was Harford and Benjy, and the other was Ivy and Mr. Chatford. Mr. Chatford was like that. Dr. Bickley was listening to Black Spot, talking Black Spot, and apparently thinking exclusively in terms of Black Spot. No one could have guessed that all the time his ear was cocked towards the front door, listening for the sound of a car or a bell. Yet, preoccupied though he was, Dr. Bickley had not been too much so to throw an observant eye over the newcomer. No new feminine arrival could escape that. On this occasion he was frankly disappointed. He had expected a pretty girl. Madeleine Cranmer was nothing of the sort. She was not exactly plain, she was just nondescript, except for her eyes. They really were beautiful. But her mouth was too wide, her face too sallow, her cheekbones too high for prettiness, and such of her black hair as could be seen under her hat looked positively dank. Her figure was good, fairly tall, slender and straight, but Dr. Bickley was shocked to observe that she dressed quite appallingly. Dress was most important, in Dr. Bickley's opinion, and for a wealthy young girl to appear on an occasion of such importance in a most uninteresting white frock, obviously not new and looking suspiciously homemade, frankly cotton stockings, a hat that was nothing but dowdy, and nondescript shoes, struck him as little less than an outrage. He dismissed Miss Cranmer as impossible from all points of view. "Edmund," said Mrs. Bickley loudly and distinctly, "Mr. Torr has nothing to eat. Do please remember to look after your guests." Dr. Bickley started, broke off in mid-sentence, and hurried across the room to minister to the Reverend Hessery's fleshly needs. Gwynifred Rattery did not arrive until the middle of the second set after tea, when Dr. Bickley had given up in despair all hope of ever seeing her again. Her excuses were unusual, but to those who knew her father, not unreasonable. Major Rattery invariably insisted on a set of tennis immediately after tea to keep himself fit. As he refused with equal vehemence to take this exercise anywhere but on his own court and with his own daughter, Gwynifred had been unable to leave until she had afforded it to him. That she should not have told her unreasonable parent to whistle for his game, if he could not take it at a less selfish time, appeared to surprise nobody present except Quarnion. Physically, Gwynifred Rattery was a fine creature. 24 years old, she was tall and well-made, and she played a better game of tennis than any other woman in the neighbourhood. A hard hitter with a graceful style. As for her looks, to those who could appreciate them, she was not merely striking, but beautiful. Her slightly slanting, green-grey eyes, clouds of hair of the real Titian tint, and the milky skin that often accompanies it were a real joy to look at. They hinted, too, at a full-blooded zest for life which her tennis seemed to confirm. Her manner was in direct contradiction. She minced. She looked down her pretty straight nose. She was so excessively ladylike that butter would obviously not melt even in her flaming hair. On Dr. Bickley, Gwynifred had always had a disquieting effect. She frightened him, of course. All girls did that, till he knew them thoroughly. But he could not begin to understand her. He longed to approach her, but could not decide on the way. She seemed utterly sexless, but her appearance made it seem unlikely that she really could be so. Yet Dr. Bickley knew that she did not attract the average young man of the district. All the other girls, even Quarnion Torr, seemed to be continually marching in a procession of fresh flirtations. But the name of no youth was ever mentioned seriously by the district scandal-mongers in connection with Gwynifred's. Without quite being able to diagnose the cause of this lack of enterprise on the part of Wyvern Cross's young men, beyond the extreme primness of Miss Rattery's public manner, Dr. Bickley was able to feel something about her so asexual, so frigidly virginal, so repellent in advance of any tentative overtures, that he had simply not dared to put his luck to the trial with her. For it was just this asexuality, this cold, intelligent virginity, that froze the hearty marrow of the others, which kept Dr. Bickley fluttering helplessly round the lamp of Miss Rattery's hair. A dozen times in the last 3 years he had decided that he would never approach her. He was morbidly sensitive to feminine snubs. A dozen times he had decided afresh that he must do something about it, if only once and for all, then once and for all. Meantime, he had prepared his path as well as he could, by ceaseless attentions when they met in public, a more exquisite deference than he accorded to any other woman, a smile occasionally across a crowded room as if they had some small intimacy in common, a host of other little touches to show Gwynifred that he was interested, very respectfully but very intensely, in her good self. And it had seemed to him that during the last month or two Gwynifred had responded to this treatment. Dr. Bickley was quite genuine in his feelings. He did not doubt that he was deeply in love with Gwynifred, and that she was the one woman in the world whom he ought to have married. The fact that he had been looking for this one woman so long made his discovery of her all the more poignant. The fact that he had been certain so often before of having found her elsewhere did not affect the matter in the least. He had determined at last to stake his luck, for once and for all, this very afternoon. His opportunity he had prepared carefully in advance. Under his tuition, Gwynifred was developing an interest in horticulture. He had arranged to have some hydrangea hortensia cuttings ready for her to take this afternoon. That June is not the best time of year to take hydrangea cuttings he had not mentioned. The cuttings were waiting ready in a tool shed in the farthest corner of the garden. His heart thumped a little as he said, casual enough, after the greetings and explanations were over, and before Gwynifred had settled herself into a chair, "By the way, I've got those cuttings ready for you, Gwynifred." "Oh, yes," said Gwynifred, in her most ladylike tones. "You'd better take them now, while you're free. Would you like to come along and look them over?" Not waiting for her answer, he led the way with nervous haste, and escaping his wife's observation, by the shortest route that would take them out of sight of the tennis lawn. Gwynifred followed him. The kitchen garden, where was the tool shed, was on the farther side of the house. Dr. Bickley did not pause to let Gwynifred come abreast of him till he had reached the shelter of the latter. If Gwynifred was surprised that the cuttings should be in the tool shed instead of the greenhouse, she did not show it. She walked in without hesitation as her companion opened the door for her. His heart now thumping so violently as to make him almost breathless. Dr. Bickley began in stifled tones to point out the merits of hydrangea hortensia. He dwelt on his subject at inordinate length. He repeated himself, stammered, asked foolish, temporizing questions. The familiar longing to come to the real point, and dread of doing so, had him in its grip. He sweated with nervousness. It was Gwynifred herself who finally gave him his cue. "Is that your heart beating?" she asked incredulously. "I can hear it from here." Whether this was innocence or provocation, Dr. Bickley was in too much confusion to ask himself. He stumbled blindly for the opening. "Well, can you wonder?" he muttered, and tried clumsily to embrace her. In spite of his experience, Dr. Bickley had little finesse. "Dr. Bickley!" exclaimed Gwynifred in shocked tones. "What are you doing?" She had little difficulty in extracting herself from the little man's clasp, but her alarm seemed unabated. Dr. Bickley followed her as she backed into the furthest corner of the tool shed. He did not quite know what he was saying or doing. "Gwynifred, you know I like you frightfully." "I don't." "Well, I do. You must have seen it." I've never thought of you like that at all." "I like you better than anyone I've ever known." "You say that to every girl." "I don't." "You do." "I swear I don't." A conversation is never so utterly banal as when its participants are at their most tense. "Gwynifred." "What?" "Just let me kiss you." "No." "Why not?" "I don't want you to." "But why not?" "I would never come between husband and wife," said Miss Rattery, clutching at her primness. She was almost in nervous tears. "Oh, but I like you so dreadfully. Listen, Gwynifred, I love you." "You don't? I won't listen, Dr. Bickley." "Oh, don't call me Dr. Bickley. Call me Teddy." "Let me go, please. You must let me go." "Well, just let me kiss you first," repeated Dr. Bickley doggedly. Even now he felt his self-respect could be salved if she would do that. He no longer wanted the physical contact, merely the mental satisfaction. "I will not." "Have you ever been kissed, Gwynifred?" "You've no right to ask me things like that." "I have. I love you." "I'm going." Ignominiously she pushed the little man aside by main force and hurried out of the shed, her face crimson. "Gwynifred, you mustn't. The cuttings. Only give things away." She took them without looking at him, and they walked back in silence, both breathing as if they had run a long race. The bitterness of defeat, not even glorious defeat, with a slapped face and unwilling lips masterfully kissed, but defeat, ignominious beyond words, oppressed the doctor. "Is it quite hopeless, Gwynifred?" he ventured once. "I can't think how you dared," she blazed at him. By the time they reached the court, Miss Rattery had partially recovered her control. Dr. Bickley, on the other hand, had come nearer to losing his than ever. A slow anger was burning in him, growing steadily every moment, an all-embracing anger directed as much at himself as at his companion. Gwynifred was just a fool. What time and genuine sentiment he had been wasting on her. Come between husband and wife for a kiss, indeed. Good Lord, how he had been taken in. Why, there was more, even in Ivy, silly little eternally crying Ivy, than there was in this piece of conceited affectation. And he had thought her sensible, understanding, possessed of brains instead of the usual feminine fluff. Yes, he was the fool. Mrs. Bickley had noticed their absence. She knew her husband, and contempt sharpened her voice. "Oh, there you are, Edmund. I've been wanting your—" "Yes, my dear." To all appearances, Dr. Bickley was perfectly normal. The 2 little spots of red that burned on his cheekbones were too tiny to be noticed. "They're a ball short. Benji hit one into the gooseberry bushes again. Please go and find it at once." She spoke with more than her usual peremptoriness, and her loud, grating voice could not have failed to reach every ear. The men looked most uncomfortable. Each of them had volunteered to look for the ball, and all had been told it was their host's task, and his only. The same thought was obvious now on all their faces. I'm hanged if I'd speak to a dog like that. Dr. Bickley felt his wife's tone and what lay behind it, and he felt his guest's reactions to it. The 2 tiny spots of colour on his cheekbones spread a little. And then Gwynifred Rattery laughed. It was, had Dr. Bickley been able to recognise it, only the meaningless laughter of overwrought nerves. But he did not recognise it. What he heard was the mocking of the whole world, the traditional mocking at the insignificant henpecked husband. And Gwynifred, whose respect he had so particularly wanted, whose understanding he had coveted so hungrily, had ranged herself with the mockers. He turned on his heel, his whole face flaming, and every atom of his varied emotions leapt suddenly into overmastering hatred of his wife. "My God!" he muttered to himself as he strode round the end of the court, his small body taut with anger. "My God! I can't stand this much longer. I wish she was dead. My God! I wish I could kill her.